Hi everyone, I'm back. Okay, so I waited a little while to post anything about residential schools and Indigenous people. To be honest, I wasn't really sure what to say. Like on the news lately, I've been seeing these posts about all these grave sites being found on former residential schools. And with the knowledge that I have now and the education that I have now coming from a university that is on a formal residential school site, I wasn't really that surprised. It's terrible. It's really sad. It never should have happened. But I'm not surprised. Most, if not all, residential schools have a gravesite, and it's terrible. Um, Being a white woman, I'm experiencing privilege literally based on my skin color. Whereas Indigenous children are overrepresented in the child welfare system as well as in the prisons. So there's definitely some things still that need to change in society. So for example, people are really quick to look at an Indigenous people and just have a negative thought. They might be thinking of a stereotype that they've heard that they might believe is true. For example, when I was growing up, a lot of stereotypes that I heard in regard to Indigenous people included things like, oh, they're lazy, they don't pay taxes, they get everything for free. Just a lot of things like that, really negative, really hurtful, things that just don't help the situation whatsoever. So, and not to mention, these statements aren't even true, so it's that much more hurtful, right? And to debunk a few of these stereotypes, the money that Indigenous people is getting, that they get, it's money that was transferred into a trust account when treaties were being negotiated. The accounts that holds the Indigenous money, apparently it makes over $35 billion in interest every single year. So I guess right now the accounts are worth over $2 trillion in Canada. And knowing this, it's why do these reserves still not have clean water? I think there's about 25, 26 reserves in Canada that still don't have clean water, and it's why, right? If that issue was happening in Edmonton, Toronto, Vancouver, BC, the issue would have been fixed same day, So why is it continuing to go on for Indigenous people? So I have to say, it doesn't help in school that we were essentially lied to. The textbooks that I used to read in school when I was going to public school used to talk about it. We learned very, very, very little about Indigenous people, to be honest. But what we did learn is that Columbus had discovered Canada. Canada, long before Columbus came to Canada, it was called Turtle Island. And that's what I've learned since being in university. And it was inhabited for thousands of years by these Indigenous peoples. And we didn't learn anything about residential schools, colonization, 60s scoop, none of that. We didn't learn about the wrongdoings by the government, social workers, nuns, priests, churches, none of that. I don't know. And I just feel there's just so much negativity against Indigenous people. And I think a lot of it has to do with the lack of knowledge that Canadians know. So I didn't start learning any of this really until I took the social service worker program. And then after that, it was more in depth in the Bachelor of Social Work program, which I'm very thankful that I have that education now. Because I had grown up with a bit of a racist mindset for sure. And that was developed from my surroundings. So family, friends, teachers even. So Canada is a country that was founded on colonization, colonialism, genocide. I think most people would agree that the Holocaust was wrong, for sure. All these, thousands and thousands of Jews being murdered and just because they were Jewish. Like, it's terrible. It's absolutely terrible. Yet, I find a lot of people can't seem to empathize with Indigenous people, like residential school survivors. Like, I find a lot of people still can't see the wrong in the residential schools. Like, for example, I've heard it happened in the past. Why can't they get over it? So I'm just going to take a bit of a closer look at these two statements. So it happened in the past. Well, the last residential school in Canada was closed in 1996. That is not even that long ago. So the Indigenous peoples of today, they're either survivors of these schools, children of these survivors, or grandchildren or great-grandchildren of the survivors. So in school, I learned that Indigenous children experienced physical, sexual, and emotional abuse at these schools. And like, at school, like, come on, at school, if that doesn't make you mad, it should. Like, Indigenous children were forced to go to these schools. It wasn't a choice. Their parents did not have a choice to send them. They were forced to go to these schools. These schools were often far away from their communities. Their hair was cut. They weren't allowed to practice their culture. They were punished for even speaking their own language. Children were separated by gender, so you might not have even been able to see your siblings if you were sent to a school like this. Also, some of these schools performed like experiments on the children, including experiments related to nutrition, starvation, in schools, on children. Like, how wrong is that? That is so terrible. And having 3 children of my own now, like, that just makes me so angry and sad that these children died at these schools in the care of people that weren't taking care of them. Like, it's very sad. Like, I saw something a little while ago on Facebook, and it talked about residential schools and how they have grave sites instead of playgrounds. Like, what school today has a grave site instead of a playground? Like, none, I should hope. Like, it's just awful. It's just awful. It's wrong on every single level. Okay, so now I'm going to take a look at this statement, why can't they get over it, or why can't they just get over it? So, I was sexually abused as a child, and I didn't come out about it until my early 20s, and it is not something you just get over. And at these residential schools, a lot of the children were physically, sexually, or emotionally abused, and it is not just something that you can get over. And I think telling someone to just get over it is another form of victim blaming. I honestly can't even imagine the pain that these children, these families, these communities went through. Like, children not returning home, the impacts of the abuse, like, it's very, very sad, for sure. And then the intergenerational trauma, so the trauma that's being passed on through these generations because of what they've experienced at school. And I mean, like, there's a poem out there, like, children learn what they live, and it's true. And like, if these children were pulled away from their families, not shown the love and stuff, the love, the support, the care from their parents, from their grandparents, from their community members, how can they learn to love their children if they eventually have children? So as a result of that, and as a result of the trauma that a lot of these individuals had experienced at residential schools, there's issues such as substance abuse, homelessness, poverty, and they kind of just impact, and they just pile on top of one another. Those are just some of the impacts of trauma. Not every single person that has experienced trauma is going to experience homelessness, poverty, substance abuse, but the trauma is definitely a significant factor in this, and each of these things compounds upon one another. So although residential schools have now been closed, like, the pain and the trauma haven't fully stopped. Indigenous children are incarcerated at a higher rate than children of other races. There's also an overrepresentation in the child welfare system, meaning that they represent a disproportionate number of children in the welfare system. So there's a poem called Children Learn What They Live, as I had mentioned earlier, and it's by Dorothy Law Nolt. If people learn what they live, and these Indigenous children were taken forcibly from their homes and learned abuse, how could they possibly care for their own children if they themselves didn't even learn about love, support, and care? So for too long, Indigenous people have experienced oppression and their voices have gone unheard. So I used to work security in many different hospitals in Alberta, and from my experiences, I would say that the racism in Alberta was very, very, very prevalent. Indigenous people were often seen as the problem. We would often be asked to escort Indigenous people off of the hospital property. They were showing up drunk, they were homeless, they didn't have a place to go. It was, freezing cold in the wintertime. Some of them just wanted food in their bellies, a warm place to sleep. And I see now that what they were experiencing could have been a direct result of colonialism and residential schools. But it's not something that I knew back then because I didn't have that knowledge back then. So it's a result of the trauma that Indigenous people have experienced and continue to experience to this day. I think the matters that are surrounding Indigenous people are complex. So for example, when the treaties were being signed, there was a lot of things that were promised that were different than what was actually written and being signed for. And they didn't know how to read like the English language. So they just trusted that the white people were being honest, but that wasn't the case at all. So even to this day, Indigenous people haven't received everything that they were promised in the treaty. So I think it's important for people to think critically. So consider how did you find out what you know today? Where did you learn what you know? Is it from a truthful, honest resource? Or is it a biased source? Even from the example I gave earlier, right? About me not learning about residential schools in public school in Canada. And that's where a lot of the residential schools happened, in Canada. And I wasn't even learning about it in grade school. The government has the power and control, and they're able to decide what students are learning about. So they had the control, they had the power, they have a lot of things. They could have chosen to teach students about it at that point in time. And although they're starting to implement it more today, I've heard a lot of negative things about it, that not everything they say is the truth, or they'll downplay the abuse that these individuals experience. So the racism is still very much here. As a Canadian, I've been lied to for a lot of my life in regard to Indigenous people, and I've had to relearn what I thought I already knew. Columbus did not discover Canada. It was here a long time ago. There was already people that were inhabiting it. You don't have to be Indigenous to show support to Indigenous people and Indigenous communities. So I hope that helps clear up some things. Thank you so much.